It was ugly. I mean, like I said, sometimes it was like Satan was speaking through my wife. Your viewer will have to read the book, but I point out some ugly things that seemed to me to be purely diabolical when I confronted Krista and things that happened in our home.
Hey, my friends. You know, some writers just have a gift from God. They are able to communicate in a way that's so stellar. When you read what they write, you want to read it, and whatever message they're conveying underneath what they're saying the story about, that will sink into your soul. Well, those writers can be truly dangerous if they're evil, but if they're good, they can communicate things in such a way that you are really blessed, and I mean in a very spiritual sense, to have read the writing. We have such a writer with us today, but he wrote a book that, wow. It's about his wife's addiction. And who does that? I mean, that's like, oh, really? My wife would hear that, just the concept, and go, you're never doing that. Not that she has addictions. No. But nonetheless, that's really, really down and personal. What? How do you do that? Well, this author, Kevin Wells, is a very holy man. And in fact, he's friends with a friend of mine who endorsed his book so strongly that I knew I had to talk to him. In fact, I've known him because he's written for LifeSite News as well. My complaint about Kevin Wells is that he hasn't written more for LifeSite News. But when Michael O'Brien, whom you probably all know is a great friend of mine, came out with such an incredible endorsement for him, I knew right away, this we have to do. Not only that, he tells me that this book really was sort of given to him by the Holy Spirit. And if you know anything about Michael O'Brien's writings, that's exactly what happens to him. Stay tuned for this episode of the John Henry Weston Show with author Kevin Wells. For U.S. residents, creating a will has never been easier. Thanks to My Legacy Will, an online platform free of charge, you can now create your own will and choose to include LifeSite News in it. Specify where your funeral will take place, the number of masses to be offered for your soul, and how your estate will be distributed. We would be deeply grateful if you remembered LifeSite News in your will. Visit mylegacywill.com/LifeSite News. Thank you for your support, and may God bless you. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
John Henry, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you very much.
Let's begin as we always do, with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.
Amen.
Amen. Ow. You wrote a book about your wife's addictions. It's like, it sounds right off the bat like the thing not to do. Why did you do that? And how are you getting away with that?
Yeah, what a jerk I am, huh? Husbands aren't supposed to do that, are they?
No, not at all.
Put their wife's stuff on the street. Yeah, John Henry, the fact of the matter is, I didn't want to do it. My wife, Krista, said, Kevin, write it. Matter of fact, she urged me for several months after telling her no. It's funny that you mentioned Michael O'Brien starting this podcast, because it was Michael O'Brien who I called. He's really my only writing hero. And I called him in the wilds of Canada. And I said, Michael, this is the story of my wife, and she wants me to write this book. I want to fictionalize it because it's a heck of a story. And I think I can do it not the way you do, because you're up here and I'm way down here, but I want to fictionalize it. And he said, well, tell me the story. And I did. And after speaking for not quite 10 minutes, I heard the voice of God. And John Henry, you hear his voice frequently, and he's got that low, slow voice. And he says, write it as it was. So in a lot of ways, in concert with the Holy Spirit, Krista's urging, and Michael O'Brien sort of gave me the compass. Hey, man. Well, Michael O'Brien didn't say man, but said, hey, write it as it was. So that's how The Hermit came about.
Okay. So your book, The Hermit, first of all, where people need to get it from, where can they get it from? Well, I'm sure Amazon, but where can they pick it up?
I would go to Ignatius.com.
Okay. It's Ignatius' book. And so that's why Michael O'Brien's there. He's published at Ignatius as well. So give us a story. What happened here? And I'm, as soon as you start, I'm sure people will know, ooh, that's why it was about, oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, I'll try and capsize it, John Henry. These stories are always circuitous, let's say. But about 10 or so years ago, I had brain surgery. I had a aneurysm. It was actually failed brain surgery, and was supposed to die. Um, my wife Krista never left the hospital. I guess at this point we were married for about 9 years, and a priest and his assistant came into my neuro ICU room after the failed surgery, where they couldn't. I had a what's called an arteriovenous malformation, and they couldn't get to it. The surgeons couldn't get to it, and the blood really was drowning my brain, and I was incapacitated after the surgery. And my uncle's best friend, Monsignor Tom Wells, is my uncle, my dad's brother. He was murdered in his rectory in 2000, and this priest who came into my dark, drab neuro IC room, where this is the floor in Maryland where people go to die. He said, I don't know, because I was incapacitated. And his assistant said that he knelt on my bedside and said, hey, we've been calling on the saints to intercede for you now. Is there a saint that we can call on for you? And he said that I whispered, bring my uncle down, bring Tommy down. He was Uncle Tommy, Monsignor Thomas Wells. And he stands up like a V8 moment and goes to the foot of my bed and says, hey, bud, you got to save your nephew's life. If you don't do it, he's a dead man. And so he began to call my uncle, and that's when, if Father Stack was on this podcast right now, he would tell you that lights began to pop and the entire temperature of the room began to change. And both of them knew that they were standing in the midst of something supernatural. And he said, Kevin, and this is months later when I recovered, he said, Kevin, I knew that things were happening in there, but I knew that you were healed. I knew it was a miracle when I saw sort of like a horseshoe interiorly, a horseshoe of the heavenly court around your bed. And your uncle was standing next to me and he was smiling. And I knew it was all gone. The next day it was the blood, the fluids, the AVM gone. Get out of the hospital. You're good. Get out of the hospital. And so, John Henry, to tell the story, I'm going to speed it up. Great news, right? I'm Lazarus from the grave, but no. What happened was it opened up a mother wound in my wife, Krista, a mother wound of shame. And she saw me after my close call going closer to God in ways that maybe I wasn't before. So daily mass, daily rosaries, more acts of sacrificial love, prison ministry, just, the typical thing a guy would do who's this close. And maybe he's not set right for the judgment seat, right? So Krista, interiorly, it opened up this wound of shame. She didn't know about it. I didn't know about it, but she began to secretly binge drink red wine for the first time in our marriage, in our life. And that led to a long, dark night. And just to put a bow on it, what led to the hermit during COVID-19. So it was a long time. This was a dark night, about 8 years. A holy priest. I know a lot of priests, John Henry, you do too. I don't know if I'm ever going to meet anyone like Father Martin Flum, but he sort of took a spiral staircase down into my wife's soul. And he said, I'm going to stick here. I know there's a sacramental moratorium worldwide, but I'm going nowhere, honey. I'm not going anywhere for people like you that have ghosts, wounds, addictions, whatever. I'm going to intensify my priesthood because I'm not concerned with the disease. I'm not concerned with getting sick. I'm concerned with your soul. So, Krista, I will be the shepherd of your soul, and I will keep things wide open. So when Krista healed during that wonderful year, the worst year in world history was our best year. It started our honeymoon. Krista said, write the book about what a strong, muscular, holy priest did for me during COVID. So maybe in the future, if another pandemic comes down the pike, they can see what this priest did to heal me.
What was it that was so stunning that this priest did? I mean, I presume the confession and stuff, but what else does a priest do?
Father Flum, from the very beginning of his even seminary days, he set himself right where he stopped eating meat. He stopped all alcohol because he knew it could soften sort of the burden of his identity. If he was going to mimic the starved man on the cross, he needed to strip himself away. So by the time he became a priest, he was set right for taking on the burden of who he was, Jesus Christ in persona Christi. So for Krista in particular, he knew prior to COVID, where he had been working with her, he knew her woundedness. So as I mentioned earlier, he was consumed with trying to get the little demons and snakes and beasts out of her soul. The shame, it's all about shame, shame, shame. So he intensified spiritual direction. He allowed holy hour for Krista as many as 2-3 hours a day. He allowed daily mass from the very beginning of COVID. All the things that a shepherd would do for a wounded lamb, Father Flum did, not just for Krista, but for others or two that were suffering. So really, he just said, Krista, I'm not going to let you go. The church has responded sort of in a strange way to COVID, but I'm not going to let you go. So he was our shepherd during COVID.
Now, that would have put him into trouble. I know, for instance, in Canada, we were at once told that if you continued with celebrations of any kind, you would be charged $10,000 for the institution and $10,000 for each participant. Was he facing any kind of danger that way?
Father Flum was brilliant, read the church doctors. If you went into his library, you would see books 12 inches thick on the Encyclopedia of the Saints. And so when he read the first release from, it was Cardinal Gregory, about sort of how the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. was going to handle COVID, he read loopholes. So his secretary said he came out of the office that day, the very beginning of COVID, and he had this secret smile on. So for your viewer, Father Flum, just to put a face on him, he's got this big Old Testament beard. He looks like Ezekiel. He just looks like a mystic. And he came out and he had that smile hiding in his beard, and he said, "Yeah, I think I know how to handle this one." So he navigated the loopholes of bureaucracy, and he found a way.
Where is Father Flum now? I mean, what parish is he at?
Father Flum in 2021 approached Krista and said, "Hey, Krista, I'm going to tell you now, this is a year and a half after Krista's healing," and said, "Mary's calling me to offer the rest of my life as a consecrated hermit. I want to turn myself over really as a Holocaust for the state of this world." We saw what happened during the summer of 2020 when the moratorium of the sacraments, we saw BLM, we saw riots, we saw fires in the streets, murders. So Father Flum believed, and I do too, and John Henry, I imagine you do as well, that whenever you constrain the sacramental graces of the Catholic Church, well, the devil's like, well, he just whistles to his chorus of demons and says, "Go in." They're not even trying anymore. And we saw that in 2020, and Father Flum did too. So about a year later, he offered Mary the rest of his life. So now, today, to answer your question, John Henry, the remainder of his life will be spent in a cell in a forest, no larger than your childhood bedroom. So essentially his room is the monstrance, and his life is penances, mortifications, and prayers. Just like St. Anthony of the Desert. I know it's a rare vocation, but it's real, and some priests take it on. And if in this area, those that know Father Flum know he's not only taking it on, but imagine that what's happening now, 3 or 4 years in, is that he's also taken on what all the great desert monks did, and that's the devil, because that's what Father Flum wants. He wants to pick fights with the devil to take him out of this woke Western culture. So he's fighting the devil for our souls, for our nations, for our church, for the recovery of the priesthood. That's what Father Flum's going to do for the remainder of his life.
Just so people get a vision of that a little bit more, really, perhaps, you mentioned even before his priesthood, I believe, that he had already given up all alcohol and also all meat.
He was in love with how the saints acted. So if John Vianney converted all of ours after the French Revolution, well, he wanted to know what John Vianney did. So, John Vianney mortified his body. John Vianney was 12 to 14 hours in the confessional. He actually worked 18 to 20 hours every day and woke up at the Angelus bells at 3 a.m. to begin his day. Well, that's what I want to do, because I want to help my parishioners. So yeah, anything that he knew could soften his identity, or like he saw comfort as almost like demonic. Like, if it's comfortable, I'm going to cast it off, because if I embrace any measure of comfort, then it could sort of metastasize or expand. So he was always fighting off things. And by the way, he wasn't like a holier than thou guy. He had Jesus exuding in him. He had joy, he had love, but man, was he tough. He was tough because he had rejected the world. So you reject the world and attune to souls. That kind of wraps up his life. World, you're no good. Saints, you are. Jesus Christ, I serve you alone, and I consecrate it all to Mary. That's kind of who Father Flum is.
So oftentimes when I'll be fasting, my mood is not the greatest sometimes. It's sharper and less charitable. Was that characteristic of Father?
It's like anything else. When you hate to make it simple like this, but when you lift weights and you use those muscles for so long, after a while, you're just like, well, it's a fast. Not only that you be, and I'm like you, John Henry, I become like a jerk too, but not only don't you become angrier or ornery, you actually say, let's extend this fast another day. It's like, give me more. Let me extend myself more, because he was always seeing Jesus Christ as a starved man on the cross who poured himself out. Jesus for him was the poor man of Nazareth who had no place to lay his head. He slept outdoors, Jesus did. So Father Flum said, well, if I call myself an ambassador of Christ and attuned to souls, then I got to try and resemble him.
Pope Pius XI said, men must look for the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. And he urged that the faithful give public honor to Christ the King so that individuals and states would submit once more to the rule of their Savior. And that is why LifeSite News is raising up the image of Christ the King across the United States. And you can help us reach millions more. Please pledge your support today for these billboards at lifefunder.com/Christ is King. One of the things that goes on today is such a priest as you're describing is rare in the extreme. Just the exact stellar opposite approach vis-a-vis what happened during COVID. I personally believe that the church had an exquisite, unique opportunity during COVID to resurrect herself like few other times in history. Imagine had it gone the other way. The government says shut down. The church says, be gone, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. And says, no, we're going to, you say we need healing. Let's have healing. The Mass is the most healing thing there is. And it could have been so different. And the world would have flocked to the church. I mean, in my imagination anyway. But what do you think is the example for the church, for her clergy, that Father Flum brings?
If historians are honest, 100 years from now, and they look into 2020 in the Catholic Church, I think they'll conclude that it was one of the worst moments in the history of the Catholic Church in the millennia. They responded terribly. I'm not here to pick a fight with how horribly they responded. But what you said is very prescient. Whenever a pandemic comes around, like Aloysius Gonzaga, Charles Borromeo, they understood, no, you don't close up shop and lock your doors, your presbytery. You go out into the killing fields and you pray over the ones that are dying. And if you happen to catch leprosy, Damon of Malachi, or if you happen to catch it, Charles Borromeo, the bubonic plague, well, you saved a lot of souls in the process. So I imagine if this comes down again, I think the church, let's be honest, I think the church looks back at that time and says, we failed. Now, has there been a reckoning? No, there hasn't really. Has there been apologies to the flock? No, there hasn't. But that's why I'm so thankful that Krista asked me to write The Hermit, because Father Flum is he's that plane with puffing out those skywriting words, be a priest during pandemics, don't quit the fight. So yeah, you bring up an excellent point.
One of the things I'd love you to get into is the book. When you told me about it, you mentioned about how when you wrote it, you thought you were writing one book and what turned out was something else. Tell us about that.
I wouldn't call myself a supernaturalist, maybe in the dimension that Michael O'Brien is. I'd love to do everything out of my soul. And, I'm Irish, so I'm sure there's a lot of that churning and burning in me. But the book that Krista asked me to write was about Father Flum and what he did during COVID to heal her. And once I finally got around to it and began to write, it was tough to get to. I kept wanting to get to COVID-19, like the transcendent part, the recovery, the resurrection. Krista's coming out of the tomb. Yay. I couldn't get to it in my writing. And I didn't know why, but I just kept writing. And I thought by chapter 4 or 5, I could get to Father Flum and the recovery, but I kept, chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I couldn't get to it. So finally, chapter 11, I got to the recovery and Krista's and the fun, kind of the fun part of the book. And when I finished, I sent it off to 4 friends, a theologian, a couple of Catholic writers, and another person. And I explained to them, hey, I feel kind of uncomfortable about this book. I read about my wife's addiction and what Father Flum did, but I wanted to show, and Krista wanted to show what a priest who healed her during COVID, et cetera. Tell me what you think. And then one by one, they all got back and they really said the same thing. And they said, Kevin, we know what you thought you were doing, but you wrote a book about marriage. And I thought the first guy had it wrong, and he lost the plot. And second guy, third, they all said this book is about marriage. And then since the book came out just a month or two ago from Ignatius, Krista and I are getting letters and emails from throughout the country of married couples in travail. I don't know how to handle my porn addicted husband. I don't know what to do with my wife. She doesn't look at me anymore. And the book really, John Henry, and I'll sort of shut it down here. I didn't know that I was mourning as I was writing. I never mourned. And the mourning process was me writing, this is what I had to do in the dark night of the soul. I had to nail my unknowingness of Krista's recovery to the cross. I had to nail myself to the cross and say, God, I don't, she hates me. She's on the other side of the ocean. I speak a different language. But God, you're faithful and you will make this thing right. And I just got to love her with no consolations, no marital entitlements, no good days, none of that. I need to love the way you did from the cross with nothing, naked in front of your mother, friends all run away except for beloved John, tortured, Jews mocking you. Well, it didn't matter. You loved us regardless. And Lord, if I'm going to say I'm a follower of you and I love Krista, I'm not going to abandon the ship. I got to love her with no consolation. So I was loving Krista, I guess, in a desert. And I think that's what resonated, is sort of the unveiling of what I did or what I tried to do as best I could. And there was failing days, John Henry, during those days when I just tried to hang on to God and say, God, you hang on to me. I'm going to keep trying to love her the best I can.
Do you guys have children?
We have 3 children. And
how old are they, and how old were they during this process?
I was always juggling. I was like, as soon as I sensed that the kids understand their mom's addiction, it's getting worse, or she's not maternally loving them the way she should, I'm going to quit my job right away. And that's what ended up happening. I ended up moving home, took a sabbatical from work, and I had a pretty good job. But I needed to stand by my wife. But at that time, John Henry, they were young, but they were growing older, and kids aren't stupid. So now they're older. Now we got 23, 21, and 16. When I first, 23, Gabby, my 23-year-old daughter, when I first sensed, like I would always kind of look into the nook and crannies of her eyes and ask her questions. And if I sensed any kind of fear or like, Dad, what's going on with your marriage? What's going on with mommy? As soon as I sensed that first conversation was bad, then it was time to go home. And that's what I did.
That's really, really tough. The whole discernment thing, because that must have been crazy for you. I got to discern, well, I'm going to deprive my kids of their livelihood. I might be able to scrape by somehow, but yet I've got to provide for them. How did you discern that thing?
That's why God's so good. I had a good job. I was making a good salary. I was at the family business, masonry contracting. We've been around forever. So I had a good amount of money saved up. So that's number one, in a practical way. Number two, it's all about trusting God. And John Henry, you'll get a kick out of this. When I was home with Krista, and she really appreciated that her man came home. She knew why. She knew I was there to protect her or love her the best I could. She was still sick then. but she appreciated it. But I needed something to do. So you'll appreciate this. I began to write a book that every Catholic publisher rejected because I'm a writer. I've been writing my whole life. I used to be a professional journalist and I had to pass the time. So I wrote a book that every publisher rejected until the Washington Post broke a story in June of 2018. And then the publishers came back and said, "Are you still working on that book?" And I said, "Yeah." And then a little while later, The Priest We Need to Save the Church came out and it became a Catholic bestseller almost overnight. Not because of the writer, but because I was attuned to things much prior to that going wrong in the church. There wasn't enough Father Flums, let's say. And so the book now has been read by, it's in seminaries on 5 continents. It's been read by thousands of clergy members, bishops. So God is so good because sure, I had the money saved for my job, but he also opened up a new avenue for me to return to a lot more writing. So I've written 4 books since then. So God's got a great sense of humor. God's been very good to me.
I want to ask you about what some of this was like. Because every guy knows in our relationships with our wives that there are times of real struggle. But if you compound that with an addiction of some kind and then no respite, there are some men who have to deal with that and sometimes lose their wives to that. But those are torturous situations. But then you had the kids at the same time and had to deal with young kids and try and keep them afloat mentally, but mostly spiritually. Can you give us a little piece of that?
I had to strip myself away from everything I ever knew. I had to accept that I would never receive the love in the way I had hoped or the honeymoon stage of our marriage. God, this is a desert, but I understand that Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Moses, when you called them further into the desert, they took their walking stick and went in to find you. And this desert isn't a place really to get sand whipped and starve to death and go to sleep with nothing to drink and be lonely. This is a place that I can encounter you in a deeper way. So that desert, and it was a desert, it was awful. It was a dark night. I mean, I'll just say it was dark, but it was a palace because I encountered God in a way I never could have ever imagined without this. I guess in a way John of the Cross did when he wrote from Spain. I in the dark night, I experienced God in a very illuminative way where he spoke to my soul. You know, really it gets to the point, John Henry, where you realize as a man that you can't pray it away with rosaries. Adorations don't take it away. Cold showers, fasts, they don't take it away. What I needed to do and what I ended up doing, which helped, was I followed the way of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And and beloved John, and I just rested my head against his Sacred Heart. And I said, Jesus, I'm just hanging on. And I'm not going to speak. There's nothing you know it all. It's withering, but God, you're faithful. And you love Krista and you love me and you want it to be right for our kids and you want a healthy mom in the house, a healthy wife. So I'm going to wait it out and I'm just going to nail myself to the hardwood the best I can and try and love the way you did. I'm just going to try and love I'll fail many, many, many times, but I'm going to try to nail myself to your cross and love with no consolations.
To get a glimpse of the inside of this, was there, loud, disparaging talk, to put it very mildly?
Are you kidding me? All the time. Well, you're always walking on a gangplank because even Krista understood, for the most part, she didn't want our children to know. So yeah, it was almost, you know what, John Henry, what it was like was this. Those watching right now will understand this. Those that have an addicted spouse, you understand that you're speaking to someone who's firmly under an oppression. It's almost like the talons are here. The demon ventriloquist is allowing my wife to say something that it's not her voice. She's responding in a way that's unreasoned. So when you can accept that the ugliness of the fights, it doesn't really matter because it's not her. The umbilical cord to heaven's cut off. The wine fills the shame. So that's the poison. That's the poison juice. I knew Krista could come back where the umbilical cord could go to heaven and be nourished by something healthy, the graces. So yeah, it was ugly. I mean, like I said, sometimes it was like Satan was speaking through my wife. I mean, your viewer will have to read the book, but I point out some ugly things that seem to me to be purely diabolical when I confronted Krista and things that happened in our home. And I'm not one of these guys who embellishes these stories. Matter of fact, I grew up in a home that we were very Catholic. We prayed the rosary. There's 10 of us. But my dad and mom were like, hey, your faith is your faith. We don't need the supernatural for you to believe more. And that's how I but I saw things and I experienced things that were of the devil. And I know this because when Krista began to recover and went to Unbound and exorcists and people began to pray over her, she manifested. I mean, again, I'll say it again. I said this a few minutes ago. The devil is directly involved with alcoholism. And also, I'll say this, the devil also loves when a little girl is wounded by her mother at a young age. And the girl thinks, man, I thought mom's supposed to love me and I'm not pretty enough, or I should be more like my sister. And that's when the devil says, I got her. She's mine. And that's what the devil tried to do to Krista until Father Flum broke in and said, Kevin, you step aside. You played it the best you could. Let me work with Our Lady. Let me work with Jesus. Let me work with the sacraments. Let me go to work now. You just take a break.
How did you do some of that shielding of your kids from it? I think for a lot of parents who go through this, either of the spouse is addicted or whatever, or just frankly, just in a bad mood, how did you shield your kids, or what did you do for your children?
A couple of things in a supernatural dimension. I'm a big believer in prayer. I mean, really big believer in prayer. Every night I would go by their bedside. It's actually in the book. And as they slept, I prayed over them. I prayed with them. I begged God to protect them, to give them a good mommy, to bring mommy back. So that was one thing. And if they were awake, then I would just pray with them in a normal way without mentioning, the problems in a concrete way. All fathers do this, I imagine, or fathers who are attuned to their identity. You just love harder. Like, my kids were athletes. So on the car ride across town, 45 minutes away, you have good conversations. You talk about their day, school, the game they're going to play in, but you always bring in moments of God. Hey, how you feeling, bud? How you feeling? What's going on? Oh, Dad, I'm good. No. How you really feeling? Dad, so it was sort of a psychological dad. It was a fun dad. It was a hardworking dad because, you gotta make sure your kids are safe, but it was also a dad who prayed. And I did not miss praying over them or with them every single night. I hate the fact that there may be people watching right now that are in a troubled marriage, that are tired of their spouse who doesn't look them in the eyes anymore, goes to bed without, or maybe they have an addiction. What I would encourage is this: don't give up. Do not give up. Obviously, if there's violence, you need to leave the home. We know that, but you will always have a heartbeat's chance if you truly have the faith of the saints, of the martyrs, and say, God, it's tough, but I believe in you. And you hear my prayers, you hear my pleas, and you are faithful, God. So I'm going to stick with it. And I know it's not going to get better anytime soon. I know it. But God, you will make this thing right. So I would encourage your viewer to keep that in mind. If you're a man, do not be effeminate. Do not separate and divorce. Do not be effeminate. Be a man, be muscular, and stick by your wife's side. If you're a woman, everyone needs a spiritual director, but I encourage you to seek out somebody like Father Martin Flum, who healed my wife. And you can always see a priest by the light in his eyes if they're really attuned to souls. So ask around. If you're just in an awful marriage, and I'm, as I mentioned, I'm getting a lot of pretty nasty emails and letters about bad marriages. I always encourage, look for a holy priest who will stick with you in this, who will be by your side. So that's what I would encourage. Stick by your wounded spouse's side and try and get a director to help lead you through.
Kevin Wells, thank you for joining us. Your life story reminds me of a former guest I had who basically said the one quality you want to look for in your spouse is a willingness to suffer, to not be afraid of the cross. You, my friend, have taken that on, and you had a great example in Father Flum to do that as well. The book, ladies and gentlemen, is The Hermit, available from Ignatius Press. Kevin Wells, thank you so much for joining us. God bless you.
Thank you very much, John Henry. God bless you.
And God bless all of you. And we'll see you next time.
The Lord be with you. I'm Deacon Keith Fournier, and I hope you enjoyed this video from LifeSite News. Check the links in the description for more content like this. You can also connect with LifeSite News on social media and stay up to date with the latest news on life, faith, family, and freedom. Thanks for watching, and may the Lord bless you.